Welcome to the Catholic Heritage Show. I'm your host, Dr. Erik Estrada, and this week we're going to be talking about the various criteria the early church used to determine the New Testament canon. This week we'll be talking about the criterion of antiquity. So thank you so much for joining us today in whatever medium you're consuming this content. We're going to continue our discussion about the church and the criteria the church used to determine the New Testament canon. So we're going to be talking about this subject of antiquity in this episode, but we're also going to be exploring other criteria in subsequent episodes. If you haven't heard our first episodes on this topic in this mini-series on the New Testament canon, please go back and listen to those. So you'll find them very helpful, especially the first. So we're going to be talking about the question of antiquity and how that was used as a criterion for determining the New Testament canon. Before we delve into that, I want to take a quick second, though, to encourage all our audience to do two things. Number one, I would encourage you to please navigate to CatholicHeritageShow.com/episode 8. That's the number 8. And there you'll be able to leave comments, ask questions, or provide feedback so that we can learn more about your thoughts and develop new shows for this series. So I want to also, secondly, encourage everyone to subscribe to this show wherever it is they may be consuming it, whether it be through video or podcast format. That will allow you to, be informed or be notified about the latest release, and secondly will help us understand and help us boost the visibility and discoverability of this show for those who have not yet heard. So I want to first ask this question as we talk now and get into our episode here, just to sort of frame it. We did a pre-recording of this episode, so we're going to cut to the episode in just a second, but I wanted to sort of frame what it is we're talking about and why it is we're discussing it. So every Christian, regardless of their affiliation, whether they be Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, has to answer or ask and answer a very important question, which is, why do I accept a 27-book canon for the New Testament? Why is it that I accept, for example, such texts as the Gospel of Matthew, the Acts of the Apostles, the Pauline epistles, the letter of Jude, the book of Revelation? Why do I accept these books, and why do I listen to them with agreement on a given Sunday? Why do I accept the authority of these books? This is a very, very important question to answer, because we live in a world that doesn't accept the authority of the Scriptures at all, and for that matter, we are in a pluralistic world where the authority of the Scriptures is questioned, like many other things. And so as Christians, we have to think collectively about, well, how are we going to answer these questions? Like, why do I accept a 27-book canon? We're going to be getting to that question and many others in this episode, so I encourage you to listen and let me know if you have any questions. Now for the second criterion, antiquity. So this second criterion is connected to the first, because a book had to be ancient. And if it was ancient, it was most likely connected to the apostles, right? If this book emerged from, say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, or say the first century of the Common Era, there was an awareness that there is a really good chance that this book ought to be regarded as part of the new collection or the new list of scriptural books. This idea of antiquity is an ancient Greco-Roman idea. So when you look in Greco-Roman writings by Greek and Roman authors, you'll find the notion that antiquity is equal to verity or truth, right? That truth is not to be found in what was thought up 2 weeks ago, but rather what has been held from time immemorial, right? And this is an interesting criterion that you find in various authors. One of the difficulties with this criterion is that it was a little too broad. And so the early Christians cared about the antiquity of an idea because they thought that it pointed to this early apostolic matrix that reflected a book's early composition. So the book had to have been written during... So before I just wanted to draw a quick point of contrast. So in antiquity, there's this notion that what's ancient is true, although certainly not in all cases, right? Not everyone thought that, but a lot of people did. And I would just contrast this notion of antiquity equals truth with like the Enlightenment's idea, which is that antiquity equals error, right? Or most likely error. Or an idea that needs to be superseded, an outdated notion. This is a key point, I think, that early Christians took seriously, that what came down from the early church, right, from earlier generations, needed to be respected. And in the case of these scriptural books written by apostles, there was a definite antiquity. This notion of antiquity seems to have been recognized as well across the entire Christian spectrum. So even Gnostics were fond of penning books and attaching them to names of apostles, because again, there was that pervasive sense that this book had to have been written in times past, right? This couldn't have been a book written last week. In order for it to possess authority within the church, it needs to have been ancient, right, or early. One can see this idea about antiquity equals truth in the Muratorian Canon. So whenever this early list was composed, whether it was the late 2nd or even the 4th century, the Muratorian Canon assumes the criterion that antiquity is truth, right? And the authors contrasts the heretical text composed in recent times, and the author mentions Marcion. I'll give you the quote here. Here is current also one to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians, forged in Paul's name to suit the heresy of Marcion, and several others which cannot be received into the Catholic Church, for it is not fitting that gall be mixed with honey, close quote. So this author talks about these books that are of recent composition and they can't be received. And underlying this statement is that they're recent concoctions by Marcion and his group. Athanasius in the 4th century is going to say something very similar, that in his 39th epistle, his festal letter, where he gives that list of New Testament books, he takes issue with the various heretics such as Marcion, Meletian, Manichaean, or Mani, the Montanists, and others. And he writes this list because these groups have produced sacred books, which are being put off as sacred scripture. And one of the things that Athanasius says is that, and I'll quote him, they are the invention of heretics who write them when they choose, bestowing upon them their approbation and assigning them to them a date, that so, using them as ancient writings, again, here's a key point, they may find occasion to lead astray the simple, close quote. So Athanasius here is thinking about dates, time, antiquity here, and they're putting them off. These groups are putting off these books as if they were 1st century compositions. That's important, right? That's important in the mind of Athanasius, that when we talk about canon, we're talking about a list of ancient books, right? Not something written in the 4th century or the 3rd, whatever. Just grab a quick drink here. I think the question of antiquity is important because some of the books that will be included, books that will eventually be rejected, books that will get on the list of New Testament books, books like Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the Clement of Alexandria, these books will make it on the list of canonical books precisely because they're ancient, right? And they're not late 2nd or 3rd century compositions. These books are in existence already in the 2nd century and maybe even in the late 1st. And that's important to realize. And I think when we're looking at early Christian theology and thinking about their structures of authority, we have to realize that these ancient books that I just mentioned that didn't make the canon of the New Testament were taken very seriously because they were ancient, because they had been read for generations and generations in the churches that produced them. And so I think we need to think about that very carefully when we're looking at the theology of the New Testament, as I said in another episode of, not New Testament, but of early Christian authors, because they are operating with a repertoire of books, a list of books that doesn't correspond to ours in all points, but has many more books that reflect a broader array of possibilities and ideas. And so I think that's really critical. So the second criterion of antiquity strikes home at notions of truth, notions of authority. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we talked about another criterion that the early church used to determine the canon of the New Testament. I want to continue this conversation about the canon of the New Testament in future episodes, so stay tuned. We have more episodes coming down the pipe about this question, about the various criteria which the early church used to determine the canon of the New Testament. I wanted to close today by giving us a question for discussion that we can take up in the show notes on our webpage. Here is the question. So with regard to the antiquity of the early sacred books of the church, my question is, how could Christians know in the early church, that is the 2nd through 5th centuries, if their sacred books were in fact ancient? So that's my question. The second kind of follow-up question to this is this: does this answer point to the authority of the church? So I've argued that in my main thesis in the first video in this mini-series on the New Testament canon and the criteria used to determine it, that most of the criteria point in one way or another to church authority. And so that's my question. How could Christians in the early church, 2nd through 4th centuries, know if their sacred books were in fact ancient? And does the answer to this question point to the authority of the church? So I'd love to take up your feedback and your response to this question in the comments section. We have a comments page at the following link, catholicheritageshow.com/episode 8. That's simply the number 8. I'll say that again, catholicheritageshow.com/episode 8. There you can leave comments, questions, or any feedback. And so I would encourage you to leave your feedback and ask further questions so that we can maybe make more videos and more content in this area. Thank you so much for stopping by. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.